In 1979, the Plessey Company sold Garrard Engineering and Manufacturing for £1 million. £1 million. The price of a modest house on the edge of Swindon where the factory stood. The company that had built the turntable used in broadcasting studios on 6 continents sold for less than some of those studios paid for their equipment. A decade earlier, the Garrard 301 was the reference standard for professional vinyl replay on Earth. The BBC used it. Radio stations from Wellington to Lagos used it. The hi-fi press treated its specifications as the ceiling of what mechanical engineering could achieve in a domestic listening room. In workshops in Swindon, men who had learned their craft in the tradition of the Great Western Railway built it by hand to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and the world agreed it was the finest thing of its kind. By 1982, the Swindon assembly line was silent. But the story of Garrard is not the story of Japan. Every audiophile alive in 1975 will tell you Japan destroyed the British turntable. They are not wrong. They are, however, incomplete. Because while Garrard was watching the horizon for the threat from Monosaka, the knife that opened the wound was already in Birmingham. And it was British. If you care about what Britain made and what Britain lost, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe and stay with us, because this story has a villain you will not see coming. Swindon, in the county of Wiltshire, is not a city that announces itself. It sits in the broad vale between the Cotswolds and the Marlborough Downs, unremarkable from the road easy to pass through without stopping. But for most of the 20th century, Swindon was one of the most precisely engineered places in Britain. The reason was the Great Western Railway. The GWR established its locomotive works in Swindon in 1843. At its peak, the works employed over 14,000 people: machinists, boilermakers, fitters, pattern makers, an entire town organized around the discipline of keeping metal moving to tolerance. The men who came out of the GWR apprenticeship program did not simply know how to work metal. They knew how to work it exactly. Fractions of a millimeter were not abstractions. They were the difference between a locomotive that held its line and one that did not. When Garrard Engineering and Manufacturing arrived in Swindon in 1919, it arrived into that culture. The company had been formed 4 years earlier in London, carrying the name of the Garrard family jewelers and precision craftsmen who held a royal warrant from the Crown. The move to Swindon was unplanned. A lease dispute had forced the company out of its original premises in Willesden, and Swindon offered something no other English town could offer, in quite the same proportion a surplus of skilled engineers with nowhere to put their hands. The match was not accidental. Garrard made precision mechanisms the kind of work that required the same habits of mind the GWR had spent 80 years installing in its workforce. The company's early products were not turntables. They were components, instruments, mechanisms for gramophone equipment, the kind of sub-assemblies that required fine tolerances and could not be hurried. The workforce that built them had learned on the shop floor of the locomotive works that hurrying precision was not a shortcut. It was a different activity entirely. By the early 1930s, Garrard had established itself as a supplier to the British gramophone industry. The long-playing record had not yet arrived, would not arrive until 1948, but the domestic gramophone was already a presence in British homes, and the mechanisms that drove the turntable needed to be right. Speed consistency was not a luxury. A gramophone that ran fast or slow did not simply inconvenience the listener. It changed the music. A violinist's pitch, a singer's tone, a pianist's tempo, all of it shifted if the motor could not hold its line. The men who understood that and who built against it were the men Swindon had trained. The decisive moment came in 1953. Garrard's engineering team, led by E.W. Mortimer, completed work on a new motor unit designed for professional transcription, used the playing of lacquer or acetate discs in broadcasting and studio environments, where speed accuracy was not merely a matter of listening pleasure, but of broadcast compliance. Mortimer described the result with the understatement characteristic of his profession, one of the best motors of its type obtainable. He was being modest to the point of misdirection. The machine Mortimer's team had built was the Garrard 301. It used a shaded pole synchronous AC induction motor running at approximately 1/740 revolutions per minute, driving a rubber idler wheel, a precision-machined intermediate contact point, which in turn drove the platter from the inside of its rim. An eddy current braking system allowed the operator to trim the speed at 33 1/3, 45, or 78 revolutions per minute, with an accuracy that no comparable mechanism had previously achieved at this price point. The platter alone weighed 6 pounds. The complete unit weighed 16. It was not light. It was not supposed to be light. Mass was part of the engineering logic. A heavier platter resisted the micro-variations in motor torque that produced the audible pitch instability called wow and flutter. The 301 did not eliminate those variations by being clever. It eliminated them by being heavy, rigid, and built to a standard that left almost no margin for error. The BBC adopted it as standard equipment for monitoring and playback. Radio stations from New Zealand to Nigeria ordered it. The hi-fi press in Britain and America reviewed it with the kind of language usually reserved for optical instruments or Swiss horology. What Swindon had built with the hands of men trained to keep locomotives on their lines was the reference turntable of the professional world. In 1953, that fact seemed permanent. It was not. To understand what the Garrard 301 meant to the people who used it, you need to understand what came before it. Before the 301, the professional broadcaster and the serious home listener faced the same problem from opposite ends. The broadcaster needed a machine that reached playing speed instantly. Lacquer discs were cued to the second, and a motor that took 30 seconds to stabilize was a motor that put silence on air. The home listener needed a machine that held its speed across the entire side of a long playing record. A deviation of a fraction of a percent sustained was enough to make a string quartet sound like it had been recorded in a slightly wrong room. No single mechanism had previously solved both problems at a price that institutions could justify and individuals could aspire to. The 301 solved both. The high-torque idler drive system, that rubber wheel pressing between motor spindle and platter rim, transmitting rotation through direct mechanical contact, reached operating speed in under half a revolution of the platter. For a broadcaster, cueing a record to air, that was the difference between professional operation and improvisation. For the home listener, the same mechanism once at speed held it with a consistency that the lighter, cheaper mechanisms of the period could not approach. What the 301 offered in physical terms was grip. The motor was powerful enough that external disturbances, a footstep on a wooden floor, a vibration transmitted through a shelf, could not deflect the platter from its set speed. The eddy current brake, adjusted by a small knob on the face of the chassis, allowed the operator to trim the speed with the kind of precision that watchmakers applied to escapements. The whole machine communicated to anyone who lifted the platter, fitted a tone arm, and set a record in motion that it had been built by people who understood what they were building and why every decision had been made as it had. That communication mattered. In the mid-1950s, the British hi-fi market was small, educated, and skeptical. The Readers of Hi-Fi News launched in 1956 as the first British publication dedicated to domestic audio, were engineers, academics, BBC employees, and serious musicians. They were not a group that responded to marketing language. They responded to specifications, to measurements, and to the evidence of their own ears. The 301 passed all 3 tests. The BBC's adoption was the certification that the market understood. When the corporation's engineers selected a piece of equipment as standard, they were not making a brand choice. They were making a technical judgment documented and reviewed against a set of broadcast engineering requirements that left no room for sentiment. The 301 met those requirements. That endorsement spread through the professional community with the speed that only institutional credibility produces. Recording studios, radio broadcasters, mastering facilities, university music departments. Every institution that needed to play a record accurately and repeatedly without variation arrived at the same conclusion. By the late 1950s, the Garrard 401 was already in development, a refinement of the 301's mechanical architecture with styling that acknowledged the shift in domestic interior design from the utility pragmatism of the early decade toward something more considered. The 401 would arrive in 1965 carrying the same idler drive principle in a chassis that looked less like a piece of broadcast equipment and more like something a man might want on the shelf of a well-furnished listening room. Between 1953 and 1965, Garrard sold an estimated 65,000 to 75,000 examples of the 301. That figure for a precision mechanism at a professional price point in a market of the size that existed at the time represents something close to total dominance. There was no credible British competitor. The American alternatives, Rec au Coût Fairchild, were expensive specialists and not widely distributed in the UK. The European alternatives were either unavailable or unproven. In Swindon, in the workshops where GWR men had trained their hands to locomotive tolerances, Garrard had built the standard by which all other standards were measured. The question was not whether the 301 was the finest turntable in the world. The question, though nobody was asking it yet, was how long that could last. In the winter of 1953, a teenager in a terraced house in Romford or Salford or Motherwell did not own a Garrard 301. The 301 was not built for her. It was built for the BBC engineer cueing a disc to air for the mastering studio cutting a reference lacquer for the university music department that needed to play a Beethoven quartet at precisely the speed the conductor had intended. The 301 lived in institutions. It was borrowed occasionally by the kind of private enthusiast who read the specifications in Hi-Fi News and saved for 2 years to acquire one. What that teenager owned, if she owned anything at all, was a Dansette. The Dansette record player was introduced by Samuel Margolin's company in the early 1950s. It was portable. It was affordable. It was available in colors red, cream, turquoise that had made it look less like a piece of equipment and more like a piece of furniture that had decided to be cheerful. It opened at the top. You stacked your records on the central spindle, pressed the lever, and one after another they dropped onto the platter and played. It was not precise. It was not particularly kind to records. It did not need to be. It needed to play Lonnie Donegan at a volume that filled a small bedroom, and it did that without complaint. Inside every Dansette was a BSR mechanism. Birmingham sound reproducers had been building record-changing mechanisms since the early 1950s, supplying them to Margolin and to every other British manufacturer who needed an auto-changer at a price that allowed a portable record player to retail within reach of a working family's budget. By the time the Dansette became the defining object of British teenage music consumption, the machine on which the first generation of British rock and roll listeners heard Elvis Presley, heard Lonnie Donegan, heard Tommy Steele BSR, was already the invisible engine of that culture. It was not the only invisible engine. By 1961, BSR employed 600 people across its factories in the Black Country Cradley Heath. Old Hill, the industrial hinterland of the West Midlands that called itself Birmingham for convenience, and was corrected by its workers with some feeling. The company was not manufacturing for the British market alone. It was manufacturing for the world. American record player manufacturers, European console stereo producers, Japanese electronics assemblers. All of them, at some point in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, fitted BSR mechanisms into their products. The OEM relationship was the foundation of BSR's scale. The company's name appeared on almost none of the finished products its mechanisms powered, but its engineering was inside nearly everything. This was the British turntable industry at its peak, and it was in fact two completely separate industries occupying the same country at the same moment with almost no connection between them. At the top, Garrard. Precision. Professional. Institutional. The 301 on the shelf of the BBC's Transcription Services Department, spinning acetates for broadcast across the Commonwealth. The 401 in the listening room of the Sirius audiophile, paired with a Decca tone arm and a cartridge that cost more than most people's weekly wage. At the base, BSR, volume, accessibility, cultural penetration. The mechanism inside the dansette, on which a 16-year-old in Liverpool heard "Rock Around the Clock" for the first time. The auto-changer in the radiogram in the front room. The turntable inside the console stereo that arrived on hire purchase in time for Christmas. Between these two Britons, the Briton of the precision workshop and the Briton of the dansette bedroom, there was a market, a middle market, a market of serious home listeners who wanted something better than BSR, but could not justify the 301. That market in the 1960s belonged to Garrard by default. And it was that market that was about to disappear. The long-playing record changed everything about how Britain listened to music, and it changed it slowly enough that nobody noticed the change was permanent until it was too late to prepare for what came next. In 1955, the LP was still a novelty in most British homes. By 1960, it was the dominant format. By 1965, the album, not the single, not the 78, not the stack of 7-inch discs on a BSR auto-changer, was the object around which serious music listening was organized. You did not stack albums. You placed one carefully on the platter. You lowered the tone arm. You listened to one side, then turned it over. The ritual required a different kind of machine than the dansette. It required a machine that could hold a speed with enough consistency that 40 minutes of music arrived in the room at the pitch and tempo the recording engineer had intended. That requirement was Garrard's natural territory. The 301 had been built precisely for sustained, accurate single-disc replay. The 401, launched in 1965 as its successor, refined the same mechanical principle in a chassis designed for the domestic listening room, lower-profile cleaner, lines a plinth that a furniture-conscious household could accept without apology. At its introduction, the 401 consolidated Garrard's position at the apex of the British hi-fi market, with the confidence of a company that had no reason to anticipate a structural challenge. The challenge was already forming. It was forming in two places simultaneously and from two entirely different directions, and the company that owned Garrard Plessey, the electronics and telecommunications conglomerate that had acquired the Swindon operation in 1960, was watching neither of them with adequate attention. The first direction was America. In the early 1960s, the Acoustic Research Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, introduced a turntable built on a different mechanical principle entirely. The AR turntable used a belt, a thin elastic loop connecting the motor pulley to the platter rather than an idler wheel. The belt absorbed motor vibrations before they reached the platter. The result was a lower noise floor than idler drive designs could achieve measured in the deep bass frequencies where turntable rumble lived. The audiophile press on both sides of the Atlantic noted the difference. Some preferred it. The belt drive principle did not displace idler drive. Overnight, the AR table had its own limitations, but it established in the minds of a generation of hi-fi writers and their readers that the idler drive mechanism was not the final answer. It was one answer, and it had a measurable weakness. Garrard's response was measured but not urgent. The 401 continued in production. The engineering team worked on refinements. Plessy, whose corporate attention was moving steadily toward semiconductors and telecommunications infrastructure, did not press for a fundamental rethink of the product line. The idler drive turntable was profitable. It was respected. It was the BBC standard. These facts taken together produced the particular institutional confidence that makes a company slow to recognize that the ground beneath it is shifting. The second direction was Japan, and from Japan the challenge was not a different mechanical principle. It was a different order of manufacturing capability entirely. In 1970, the Matsushita Electric Industrial Company, operating under the Technics brand name, introduced the SP10. It was the world's first electronic direct-drive turntable. The motor sat directly beneath the platter, its spindle becoming the platter's own spindle, eliminating both belt and idler wheel from the drive chain entirely. The speed was controlled electronically with a precision that mechanical systems could not approach. The SP10 was aimed at broadcast professionals. It was aimed, in other words, directly at the market Garrard had held, without serious competition for nearly 2 decades. 2 years later, in October 1972, Technics released the SL-1200. The war had begun, and Garrard was fighting it on the wrong ground. The Technics SL-1200 arrived in the British market as a proposition that the existing categories could not comfortably contain. It was not expensive enough to be dismissed as a specialist instrument. It was not cheap enough to be ignored as a mass-market product. It was priced and specified to occupy exactly the middle ground that Garrard had held by default since the late 1950s. The serious home listener who wanted professional-grade speed stability without professional-grade expenditure. The SL-1200's direct-drive motor eliminated the 2 components that gave idler drive its critics the most ammunition. There was no belt to stretch degrade or transmit motor noise. There was no idler wheel to harden, flatten, or introduce periodic speed variations as the rubber aged. The motor sat beneath the platter and drove it directly at speed governed by an electronic control circuit that sampled and corrected the rotation many times per second. The result on paper and in listening tests was a noise floor and a speed consistency that the Garrard 401, for all its mechanical refinement, could not match by the measurements the contemporary hi-fi press had decided were the relevant ones. This is the moment the received history of the British turntable industry tends to treat as the decisive event. Technics arrived. Technics was better by the metrics that mattered. Garrard lost. That account is not wrong. It is, however, less than half the story. While Garrard was being displaced at the top of the market by Technics, a process that unfolded across the first half of the 1970s, as the SL-1200 accumulated endorsements from professional broadcasters and audiophile reviewers on both sides of the Atlantic, something equally consequential was happening at the base of the market. Something British. Something that received almost no attention in the hi-fi press because the hi-fi press did not cover it. The hi-fi press covered equipment for serious listeners. What was happening at the base of the market was not for serious listeners. It was for everyone else. By 1977, the factories of Birmingham Sound reproducers in Cradley Heath and Old Hill were producing over 250 000 turntable mechanisms every week. Not every year, every week. By one account, for a brief period in that peak year, weekly output touched 260 000 units. The mechanisms went into console stereos, into portable record players, into the kind of mid-range music centers that were appearing in British living rooms as the decade's version of the domestic technology upgrade, the teak-veneered, illuminated dial all-in-one systems that Rumbelows and Currys stocked in their windows and sold on hire purchase to households that wanted music without complication. BSR held at its peak approximately 87% of the global OEM market for record-changing mechanisms. 9 out of every 10 record changers installed in a consumer product anywhere in the world contained a BSR mechanism, or one manufactured to BSR's specifications under license. The company that Samuel Margolin had first approached in the early 1950s to supply mechanisms for the Dansette had become without most of the hi-fi world noticing the largest turntable manufacturer on Earth. And yet BSR was not competing with Garrard. That is the crucial point that the simplified version of this story misses entirely. BSR and Garrard were not fighting over the same customers. They were not fighting at all. They occupied different segments of the same industry with such completeness that the boundary between them had never required negotiation. BSR made mechanisms for products that were sold in curries. Garrard made turntables for products that were reviewed in hi-fi news. The two companies coexisted in the same country in the same decade without collision until the market itself removed the ground between them. The ground between them was the middle market, and the middle market did not disappear because of Japan. It disappeared because of what Japan taught British consumers to expect. The SL-1200 and its successors did not merely displace Garrard among audiophiles. They redefined what a serious turntable looked like. Direct drive became the signal of modernity. Belt drive became acceptable. Idler drive became, in the language of the consumer electronics press, that was replacing the specialist hi-fi press in British newsagents old-fashioned. The technology that the BBC had adopted as its professional standard in 1954 was by the mid-1970s being written about in the past tense by journalists who had not been born when Mortimer's team completed the 301. Garrard's response to this shift was the Zero series, a range of belt-drive turntables introduced in the late 1960s and developed through the 1970s, designed to demonstrate that Swindon could compete on the new terms the market had set. The 0100 in particular was a technically ambitious machine incorporating a geometrically compensating tone arm designed to reduce tracking error across the record surface. It received respectful reviews. It sold in reasonable numbers. It did not arrest the decline. Plessy, watching from its corporate offices with the divided attention of a conglomerate whose profitable divisions were in semiconductors and defense electronics, made the assessment that any dispassionate investor would have made. Garrard was a mature business in a contracting segment. The engineering talent in Swindon was real. The brand reputation was real. But the market trajectory was not reversible by product development alone, and the capital required to compete with Matsushita's manufacturing scale was not capital that Plessy's board was prepared to commit to a turntable company. Between 1976 and 1978, Garrard's engineering team developed working demonstrators of video disc technology, an early optical storage system that prefigured the compact disc and the laser disc. The technology was promising. The team recognized its potential. Plessy reviewed the investment case and declined to proceed. The decision was not irrational, given what Plessy knew at the time. It was in retrospect the last moment at which Garrard's engineering capability might have been redirected toward a market with a future. The moment passed. The demonstrators were shelved. In 1979, Plessy sold Garrard Engineering and Manufacturing to Gradiente Electronics of Brazil for £1 million. The figure is worth dwelling on. £1 million. The company that held the BBC's professional endorsement that had built an estimated 65,000 to 75,000 examples of the finest idler drive turntable ever manufactured that employed craftsmen trained in the most demanding precision engineering tradition in British industrial history, sold for £1 million, less than some of its own turntables would fetch at auction 4 decades later. Series production moved to Manaus in the Brazilian state of Amazonas. The Swindon operation was reduced to a skeleton research and development presence. The craftsmen who remained were not building turntables. They were maintaining the appearance of continuity for a brand that had already, in every meaningful sense, left the town that made it. Meanwhile, 40 miles up the M4 corridor in spirit, if not in geography, BSR was fighting its own losing battle. The cassette tape was doing to BSR what direct drive had done to Garrard, rendering its core product not merely less competitive, but less necessary. The Sony Walkman arrived in Britain in 1980. It did not play records. It did not need a turntable. It needed a cassette, a pair of headphones, and a pocket. BSR's Waterfall Lane factory in Cradley Heath closed in June 1980. 2,300 workers lost their positions. The Pauk Lane facility in Old Hill followed in 1983, taking 1,100 more. By 1983, BSR's total workforce had fallen from a peak of thousands to under 1,400. Turntable production ceased entirely in 1984. 2 British companies, 2 different markets, 2 different enemies. The same ending within 3 years of each other in the same decade in the same country that had built them both. Nobody held a joint funeral. Nobody connected the 2 stories in the trade press. They were too different, too separated by the class distinctions of the hi-fi world for their simultaneous collapse to register as a single event. It was a single event. The Swindon assembly line fell silent in 1982. The factory that had occupied the site where GWR trained hands had built mechanisms to broadcast tolerances where EW. Mortimer's team had produced the machine the BBC chose above all others was eventually demolished. The site is now occupied by a retail park. The Range and Halfords stand where the platter bearings were fitted. There is no plaque. There is no marker. There is nothing to tell a customer pushing a trolley through the car park that the ground beneath the tarmac once produced the reference standard for professional vinyl replay on Earth. In Cradley Heath and Old Hill, the BSR factories are similarly gone. The Waterfall Lane site, the Pauk Lane facility. The Garrett's Lane factory, where 250,000 mechanisms were assembled every week at peak production. All of them cleared, repurposed, or absorbed into the general deindustrial landscape of the West Midlands. Daniel McLean MacDonald, who had founded Birmingham Sound Reproducers in a rented room in 1932 and built it into the largest turntable manufacturer in the world, lived until 1991. He saw his company's core production end 7 years before his death. What he made of that, no record states. The Garrard name did not die with the factory. It wandered. Gradiente licensed it to American companies in 1992, and for 5 years the name appeared on cassette decks and CD players and entry-level turntables manufactured in the Far East by companies with no connection to Swindon, to EW, Mortimer, or to the idler drive principle that had made the name worth licensing in the first place. The name was an asset. The knowledge that had justified the name was not transferable. These are different things, and the market understood the difference even when the licensing agreements did not. In 1997, Terence O'Sullivan, operating as Lorrycraft Audio, took a license on the Garrard name from Gradiente. O'Sullivan's operation was small, specialist, and honest about what it was, a service and restoration business for the surviving examples of the 301 and 401, not a manufacturer. For 20 years, Lorrycraft kept the knowledge alive in the only form that remained available to it, the repair of machines that were no longer being made. In 2018, the Cadence Group parent company of SME, the Sussex-based precision engineering firm that had been making tone arms for serious turntables since 1959, acquired the Garrard Audio brand from Gradiente and purchased Lorrycraft Audio outright. The announcement was made at the high-end show in Munich. A new Garrard 301, built to the original mechanical specification, would be produced in limited numbers at SME's facility in Steyning, West Sussex. The price in the configuration shown at launch was £43,945. With a specific tone arm and plinth combination, it reached £51,645. That figure requires a moment of consideration. The men who built the original 301 in Swindon were paid the wages of skilled precision engineers in 1950s Britain, good wages, honest wages that reflected the value of what their hands could do. The machine they built retailed in period terms at a price that a senior BBC engineer might save for over the course of a year. The machine that carries the same name today retails at a price that places it beyond the reach of almost everyone who ever loved the original. This is not a criticism of SME, whose engineering is genuine and whose commitment to the Garrard legacy is documented and serious. It is simply the arithmetic of what craft production costs when the industrial ecosystem that once supported it no longer exists. The original 301, meanwhile, commands its own prices. Restored examples in good condition sell at auction and through specialist dealers for figures that would have astonished the Swindon workforce that built them. The collector market operating through specialist auction houses, through the London Guitar Fair's hi-fi equivalents, through dedicated forums and reverb listings, has delivered its verdict on the question of whether the original can be replaced by new production. It cannot. Not at any price. Not because the circuit is secret or the specification is lost, but because the tolerant stack of 7 decades of matched components run in and stabilized across thousands of hours of use produces a mechanical character that cannot be replicated by building a new machine to the same drawing. The drawing is the same. The machine is different. Working musicians and session engineers in London still seek out original 301 and 401 examples for specific recording applications for the particular quality of grip and drive that idler wheel mechanisms produce in the low frequencies, a characteristic that belt drive and direct drive designs approach but do not duplicate. The idler wheel that the audiophile press declared obsolete in 1972 is in 2024 the object of a dedicated international restoration community whose technical knowledge of the Garrard mechanism exceeds anything that existed when the mechanism was in production. Britain built the finest turntable in the world. Then a British conglomerate sold it for £1 million. Then a British mass manufacturer collapsed alongside it, taking the other end of the industry down in the same decade. Then the name wandered for 30 years through licensing agreements and Far Eastern product lines before returning finally to a precision engineering workshop in West Sussex, 40 miles and 70 years from the GWR apprentices who first set the standard. The story of Garrard is not the story of Japan. Japan was the horizon Garrard watched. The wound was opened closer to home in the boardrooms of a telecommunications conglomerate that could not see what it owned, and in the slow structural collapse of the industrial Britain that had made owning such a thing possible in the first place. If you want to hear what Swindon built, you can still hear it. Somewhere in a listening room in Islington or Edinburgh or Bristol, a Garrard 301 is turning at 33 revolutions per minute. Its idler wheel pressing against the inside rim of a platter that has been spinning on and off for 60 years. The motor hums at the frequency the GWR men would have recognized. The bearing holds. The speed does not waver. The record plays at exactly the pitch it was recorded at, in exactly the room it was intended for, on a machine that the market declared finished half a century ago, and that refuses with the particular stubbornness of things built to last to agree. See you in the next one.